July 10, 1997, Prijedor Municipality, northern Bosnia. On paper, NATO's stabilization force was in the country to keep the guns quiet and the peace agreement alive. In practice, the most dangerous part of the mission was not separating former front lines. It was the question everyone avoided saying out loud: whether a peacekeeping army would ever place its own soldiers in deliberate danger to seize men indicted for genocide and crimes against humanity. For more than a year after Dayton, that question had a predictable answer. NATO commanders repeatedly signaled that their priority was force protection and stability, not manhunts. The result was a credibility problem that grew louder by the month. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia could issue indictments, but it could not execute arrests. Local authorities in Republika Srpska had no incentive to hand over powerful figures who still commanded loyalty, weapons, and fear, and so the indicted walked openly, while the international mission looked increasingly like a shield for an uneasy status quo. By mid-1997, the political costs of inaction had begun to outweigh the risks of action. Prosecutors and human rights groups warned that peace without justice was turning into impunity with a NATO perimeter. Behind the scenes, the tribunal refined its approach, leaning harder on confidential indictments and intelligence-led opportunities. In NATO headquarters, the debate narrowed to a grim operational calculation. If troops were ever going to seize indictees, it would have to be done quickly, precisely, and with overwhelming control of the immediate ground. That is where Britain's military culture and capabilities mattered. British forces in Bosnia had spent decades training for the uncomfortable space between police work and war. Special operations units were built for surveillance, rapid raids, and the disciplined use of force under strict rules. Yet even for them, the mission was different from anything in Northern Ireland or the Gulf. An arrest attempt against a wanted Bosnian Serb official was not a tidy law enforcement exercise. It risked provoking armed resistance, civilian unrest, and a chain reaction of retaliatory violence across a fragile post-war landscape. Still, on that July morning, NATO authorized a decisive move in Prijedor. British-led elements, widely reported at the time to include Special Air Service operators under SFOR command, closed in on two indicted men tied to the wartime machinery of ethnic cleansing. One target would be taken alive without a shot fired. The other would choose to resist, and in that instant, NATO's long hesitation would collide with the reality of executing justice at gunpoint, setting the tone for everything that followed in Bosnia's uneasy peace. What happened next in Prijedor was the clearest demonstration yet that arrests were never a purely legal question. They were a test of whether a peace enforcement mission could accept tactical risk for strategic legitimacy. In the hours after the detentions, SFOR and the tribunal confirmed the essentials. Two indictees from the Prijedor case were targeted under sealed indictments. One, Milan Kovacevic, was detained and transferred to The Hague the same day. The other, Simo Drljaka, was killed after resisting detention, with a SFOR soldier wounded in the exchange. In London, the politics were handled with careful, official language that still conveyed a shift. In Parliament, ministers framed the action as consistent with the international community's duty to support the War Crimes Tribunal and uphold the Dayton settlement, while stressing the constraints under which forces operated. That balance mattered. Britain needed to show determination without appearing to turn Bosnia into an open-ended counterinsurgency. It is also why these arrests were widely treated as a turning point. In reporting at the time, the operation was read as SFOR finally baring its teeth. Precisely because earlier months had been dominated by caution, legal hedging, and an implicit fear that chasing indictees could destabilize the very peace NATO had been sent to protect. Operationally, the method was as important as the outcome. The Kovacevic detention was executed with the kind of disciplined speed that reduces the chance of a crowd forming, a militia intervening, or a local chain of command improvising violence. Open-source reconstructions and later reporting describe a small team entering Prijedor Hospital, moving directly to the director's office, and extracting him rapidly to an airlift route toward Tuzla and onward to the Netherlands. The tribunal's own case record is blunt about the core fact that matters for historical verification. He was arrested by SFOR on July 10, 1997 and transferred to ICTY custody that day. Yet the other half of the operation revealed the nightmare planners had tried to prevent. Drljaka was not taken in an office. He resisted, shots were fired, and he was killed. Even when an arrest is legally justified, a lethal outcome immediately changes the information environment. It hands propaganda to hardliners, stiffens local defiance, and forces NATO to justify not only why it acted, but why it accepted bloodshed to do so. That tension, justice versus stability, would define the next phase of the manhunt, because Prijedor proved arrests were possible, but it also proved they could ignite the very violence NATO feared. In the weeks that followed, the real battle shifted from roads and checkpoints to headquarters tables, where lawyers, commanders, and ministers tried to define what supporting justice actually meant when the suspects were armed, protected, and woven into local power structures. NATO's mandate in Bosnia was written for stabilization, not manhunting, and that ambiguity had long served as a shield for caution. Britain's position, expressed carefully in Parliament, was that SFOR would support the tribunal, but would not pursue arrests in ways that were reckless, unlawful, or likely to trigger wider violence. The purpose was not to sound timid. It was to frame every detention as disciplined, legal, and strategically necessary, because the moment an arrest went wrong, the entire mission could be painted as an occupying force exceeding the peace settlement. This is where the contrast with earlier NATO practice mattered. For much of 1996 and early 1997, some of the most notorious indictees still moved with relative freedom, and critics accused SFOR of hiding behind force protection to avoid hard choices. A UK Parliamentary Defence Committee later noted the scale of international criticism over the failure to arrest indicted persons and observed that after July there were signs of a more robust approach. The strategic logic was stark. If the international mission could not enforce the authority of the tribunal, then Dayton's political architecture would rest on men who had learned they could defy the outside world without consequence. Operationally, British planning focused on collapsing uncertainty. Arrests would not be treated as cinematic snatches, but as tightly controlled security operations. Isolate the target, control the approaches, prevent crowds from forming, and extract quickly to a route that could not be cut by local police or militia networks. The aim was to remove the indictee faster than his protection could organize. That demanded patient surveillance, trustworthy human reporting, and clear rules for escalation, because in Bosnia a single exchange of fire could echo across the entity line and undo months of political work. The wider effect of that July turning point, therefore, was not only that detainees could be delivered to The Hague. It was that fugitives began to change how they lived. Human rights reporting later argued that the first NATO arrest action in July 1997 helped push senior figures like Radovan Karadzic deeper into hiding, making future arrests harder, but also confirming that the era of open impunity was ending. And as that message spread, British and Allied planners faced their next problem. Once the easy targets vanished, how do you hunt the ones protected by an entire parallel state? May 29, 1998, Banja Luka, northern Bosnia. By now, the hunt had moved into a colder phase. Fewer easy opportunities, tighter secrecy, and a growing reliance on intelligence and timing rather than brute presence. What made this period distinctive was not a single dramatic firefight, but the way SFOR began to treat arrests as a rolling campaign, measured, repeatable, and designed to steadily narrow the space in which indicted men could live normal lives. That morning, British Special Forces operating within the NATO-led force detained Milojica Kos, an indictee linked to the Omarska camp system, one of the sites that had become internationally notorious during the war. Contemporary British reporting emphasized the practical detail that mattered most to planners. He did not resist, and the detention occurred when his freedom of movement and options to evade capture were, in NATO's words, at an end. In other words, the arrest was the end of a long squeeze, not the start of a chase. This is where the contrast framing with earlier NATO hesitation becomes sharper. In Britain's own parliamentary defense reporting, there was open acknowledgement of the international criticism NATO faced for failing to detain indicted persons, and an assessment that, after mid-1997, SFOR appeared to be taking a more robust approach. That matters because it shows how the mission's logic evolved. Rather than one-off headline raids, the intent was to restore credibility through consistent enforcement, small operations that, over time, changed behavior across whole networks. Operationally, those networks were the real target. Many indictees were not protected by formal armies anymore, but by informal systems. Friendly police, local political patrons, loyal veterans, and the warning chains that ran through cafes, municipal offices, and checkpoint huts. Breaking that system demanded discretion and surprise, which is why sealed indictments and compartmented planning became so central. The tribunal needed the ability to indict without tipping off suspects, and SFOR needed the ability to act without broadcasting intent across a coalition command structure. The British advantage lay in quietly integrating surveillance, rapid action, and immediate extraction, making detention look less like a battle and more like the sudden removal of a keystone from an arch. Yet even as that approach began to work against mid-level figures, the strategic question remained unresolved. Would the same machinery ever close around the truly protected names, the men whose capture could shake entire political structures? That is where the campaign inevitably led. December 20th, 1999, Banja Luka, the administrative heart of Republika Srpska. Before dawn, a familiar pattern unfolded on a city street. A vehicle halted, a small group of SFOR troops moving with practiced speed, and a man who had lived for years inside a web of political protection suddenly finding that the outside world had finally caught up. The target this time was General Stanislav Galic, indicted for crimes connected to the siege of Sarajevo, an indictment that brought the tribunal's focus directly onto one of the most symbolically charged campaigns of the Bosnian War. British reporting at the time noted that SAS soldiers were believed to have been among the troops involved in the detention, and it highlighted a point that mattered operationally as much as morally. There was no trouble, no firefight, no crowd, no escalation, just a clean removal of a fugitive from the space he assumed was safe. By late 1999, this was the mature phase of the campaign. The real innovation was not muscle. It was process. The tribunal increasingly relied on sealed indictments, meaning suspects often learned they were wanted only at the instant of capture, while SFOR refined a method that treated arrests as a sequence of tightly controlled security problems rather than dramatic raids. British officials publicly framed these operations as lawful support to the tribunal and the Dayton settlement, but the underlying message was sharper. Every successful detention narrowed the room for the next war criminal to hide, recruit help, or bargain for immunity. From a British perspective, the contrast with the earlier period of hesitation remained central to the story. Parliamentary reporting would later state plainly that British SFOR troops had successfully detained multiple ICTY indictees and had been involved in further arrests with other SFOR forces, an official tally that quietly undercut the old narrative that NATO simply would not act. The reality was more complex and more instructive for operational analysis. NATO's reluctance was never about sympathy for suspects. It was about second-order effects, force protection, potential reprisals, and the risk that one botched operation could destabilize fragile local politics. Britain's contribution was to demonstrate that arrests could be done with discipline and repetition, turning an exceptional political decision into an enforceable routine. And yet, even as high-profile detainees were flown to The Hague, the hardest part of the mission still loomed ahead. The most wanted figures, Karadzic and Mladic, remained free, protected by networks that were harder to penetrate than any single building or street. Each new detention proved capability. Each failure proved the limits of peacekeeping when justice depends on intelligence, access, and political will in equal measure. Those limits became impossible to ignore as the calendar turned, because by 2000 Britain was no longer defending a single controversial raid. It was defending a record. In Westminster, ministers stated that British SFOR troops had successfully detained 9 ICTY indictees, assisted in 2 further arrests with other SFOR forces, and had also shot dead 1 indictee in self-defense during a detention operation. It was unusually specific language, and it mattered for one reason. It acknowledged, in official British terms, that the shift from monitoring peace to enforcing justice had already happened on the ground. But that same statement also exposed the contradiction at the heart of the Bosnia mission. Tactical competence did not automatically deliver strategic closure. SFOR could detain men who still lived recognizable routines, but the most wanted figures had adapted early, disappearing into warning networks, sympathetic communities, and political protection that worked like an informal air defense system. Success depended less on battalions and more on intelligence, discretion, and timing. because the first hint of a raid could empty a safe house long before armored vehicles arrived. So the honest historical balance sheet is narrower than the most dramatic framing. NATO did not refuse to act indefinitely. It hesitated, then acted, often with British units at the sharp end, while still trying to keep Bosnia stable enough for a fragile peace to survive. The operational lesson is that precision arrests can change behavior and reduce impunity, but they cannot, by themselves, dismantle the structures that hide fugitives. In the end, justice required sustained pressure, patient intelligence work, and political shifts inside the region as much as it required speed on a dark street. If you want more documentaries like this, like the video, subscribe, and share.